All right, at least I remembered. Am I sharing the wrong screen? Do you guys see the PowerPoint? Okay, I don't know what's going on. All right. All right, so we're gonna start with reviewing the shoulder and the arm today. Well, I'll get into the leg a little bit, not too much, and that's because the same concepts they're gonna apply to the leg that we learn with the arm, but they're generally a little bit easier with the leg, so we're not gonna spend much time on them. The leg muscles are larger and fewer, so it'll make that easier when you go to study it. So we'll start with the tricky stuff. So for appendicular musculature, just like axial, you need to know the things we need to know for axial. So that includes the name of the muscle, the origin, the insertion, and the action. So again, we've put up a table for you where you can review that. That's up on Canvas. So I recommend just printing that off. I got mine here handy. And again, we've taken those origin and insertions and actions and greatly simplified them for you. You'll notice when you're in complete anatomy, if you're looking at a muscle and it gives you origin, insertion, and action, it's going to be far more complicated. So we broke it down to the bare bones. Good pun. Okay. I think that's it. We'll begin here. All right. So the muscles of the appendicular musculature, they act to stabilize the pectoral and the pelvic girdles. And we looked at both those girdles before, remembering that a girdle is just a ring of bones that support the arms and the legs. So now we're talking about the muscles that support and stabilize those girdles, those ring of bones. Okay? So a little bit meta, but. And I've shown you this figure here before. If we do something like this, and we'll show the trade-off between, oh, I'm a little wonky there, stability and strength. So if we have strength here, or stability, I think we should call that, right? Stability. And then we have mobility down here. There's a trade-off, right? We're going to have some areas or joints that are very strong and some that are completely mobile. Okay, so if we're talking about the pectoral girdle again, remember that the pectoral, that shoulder girdle, highly mobile. So it's going to be found here on this end of the spectrum. Okay, so we see a big versatility of movement. You can easily swing your arm all around. Okay, but if we're talking about the pelvic girdle, it's going to act more as a shock absorber and give us strength rather than versatility of movement. So we're going to be found more at this end of this relationship here, this trade-off. Okay? You can't really swing your leg around in a 360 fashion, although that'd be really impressive. Okay. Hide my pen now and get my arrow back. So you're already familiar with the action terminology we've covered previously. So you'll want to review your actions if you're not up on them completely. Okay. Remember things like adduction, abduction, pronation, supination, extension, a lateral versus a medial rotation. We'll review those a little bit as they come up today, just in regards to this material. So here's a review of those actions. The table is in here. You can reference that if needed. Students always ask, what will questions be like on the practical? So, for example, obviously it's going to be within complete anatomy, and we can show you a muscle, and we can ask you, all these are going to be fair game. It's, what is the name of this muscle? What is the origin of this muscle? What is the insertion point of this muscle? Or what type of movement or action would this muscle give us? Is this going to be an adductor or an abductor? Okay. All right, so let's start today with the muscles that hold that pectoral girdle, the shoulder girdle, it's also called. Okay. So you've heard of many of these muscles before. We kind of colloquially call them things like traps, pecs, the ROMs. I don't think anyone calls them the ROMs, but it sounds good. All right, but they're probably easier to look at than they are just to sit here and name. So notice you got that complete anatomy hyperlink down here you can use when you're working through this. So on the left now, and this is also anatomical left, we have the superficial muscles, and on the right, we have the deep muscles. So let's start with the superficial ones with one you might have heard of, the traps. Maybe it will be handy to have my pen out. Okay. So the traps, or the trapezius. Okay. It's going to be important to understand the action to know the origin and the assertion, just like with axial musculature. So with the traps here, we have the origin on the vertebral column. Okay, we can see that. And then the insert upon the scapula out here. Okay. Now, these large muscles, this is a really large muscle, right? They can often do many motions based on where we're getting contraction. So for example, if the upper portion here contracts, that's gonna lift this shoulder up. And you can picture that contraction of these longitudinally oriented fibers here, okay? So that's gonna act to lift this shoulder up. But then if you picture a contraction in this direction, right? That's gonna do the opposite, and it's gonna pull down or depress the shoulder, okay? So that's the kind of thing we see with these really large muscles. You get some trade-off or variability in the types of movements we can do. So again, just reiterating, the action is a result of the origin, the insertion, and then the shape and size of that muscle. So that takes up a lot of our superficial there because it's such a large muscle. So if we move on to the right here, we can start looking at some of those deep muscles. So deep to the rhomboids, deep to the trapezius, then we have the rhomboids. Okay, so they're listing them over here. So we have the rhomboid minor and the rhomboid major. Remember, minor and major just refer to size. Minor is going to be smaller, major is going to be larger. And you can picture contraction here with these muscles. That's going to act to basically pull your shoulder blades together, right? So we have an origin on the vertebrae for both. And then we have an insertion on the scapula. So origin, insertion. So that's going to cause adduction of the scapula. So remember, abduction is being lifted up and away. Adduction is pulling closer to the body, to the midline. And you can picture, right? We're going to be pulling this inward to the midline, medial. So we get adduction of the scapula. Now, above those, you just turned the TV way up. Above those, we have the levator scapulae, right? And we can easily break down that name. We have levator to lift, and then scapulae, scapula. Okay? That's pretty easy. So we know what it's going to do. It's going to lift that scapula up. Then we got the supraspinatus, and we can break that name down. It's the supra, which means above, and the spinatus. Recall that they're on the back of the scapula, there's an area that we call the spine. So this muscle is just found above that spine. And this one's a little tricky because we have to notice here, and it's not shown so well within this image, but this tendon here of that muscle is going to wrap around the tip of this bone, goes over the tip there. So it's actually going to cause abduction of the arm there. Okay, I don't know if that makes sense. If it was connecting right here, it would cause adduction, but it's wrapping around, so it's acting to pull up. So we get abduction of the shoulder with a contraction. So we got a supraspinatus, and then following that, we have an infraspinatus. Infra meaning below. Okay. And look at the attachment here now of the infraspinatus. Okay. Kind of blocked it with my arrow previously. But where it inserts, it's kind of located a little more anterior. It's not completely on the posterior side of this. You can see it's starting to wrap around to the front, so a little more laterally, I guess you could say. And because of that, the infraspinatus, when it contracts, it rotates the arm laterally. So remember, a lateral rotation means away from the midline. So it's going to pull the arm outward. And that's due to that more lateral insertion point. And we get the same action for the muscle that's deep to the infraspinatus here, the teres minor. Again, minor meaning small. You can see its insertion point is a little inferior, but it's just as lateral as the infraspinatus. So again, that is going to give us a lateral rotation. However, we're going to get something different when we look at this teres major now. So major is a little bit bigger than this teres minor, but look at its insertion point. So it wraps around to the anterior side. So picture this contraction. That's actually going to pull your arm this way, not laterally, but rotate it medially, okay, toward the midline. So a medial rotation with that teres major. So again, look at those origin insertions. Picture what's going to happen with shortening a fiber, and you can pretty much guess the action. All right, so onto the muscles that move the arm now. Again, these are going to be more muscles that you've heard of, things called like the delts, the pecs, the lats, right? You hear these at the gym. Again, let's just look at them. I think that's a little easier. So start with one we all know here, anterior view now, not posterior anymore. So this is going to be our left, anatomical right. We see the more superficial muscles, and one that's covering them all is the pecs, the pectoralis major. Okay. I'm going to shut the door real quick because it's getting awfully loud on my end. Can we turn this down, buddy? All right. So the pecs, pectoralis major, we see the insertion, I should say the origin, is on the sternum. And then we see the, I guess you can't really see it, but the insertion is over on the humerus. So underneath the deltoid here, humerus, the upper arm, okay? So you can picture here a contraction. You can look at the orientation of these fibers here, a contraction. It's gonna pull that shoulder this direction. That's adduction, right? Not up and away, closer to the midline. So that's kind of covering everything here on the superficial side. So if we move to some deep musculature, let's move to the, how about this one? The subclavius. That's an easy one to start with. Sub, meaning below, clavius, clavicle. It's below the clavicle. We can see, in fact, that's where it's oriented. We can look at the origin, and that's actually found on the first rib there. Okay. And then the insertion, obviously, is going to be on the clavicle here. So if we look at what a contraction would do of this muscle, it's going to actually just kind of depress that clavicle, right? That means pull down. So it depresses the clavicle. And in fact, we have the same action then with the pectoralis minor here. This group of muscles here connects to the ribs and is going up. Where is its insertion point? Oh, the scapula here, I think. I can't really see. But anyway, that's going to work to do the same thing. It's going to depress, oh, sorry, that is the clavicle. So it's going to work to depress the clavicle as well, the pectoralis minor. What else? Oh, an easy one to kind of break down. We have the coracobrachialis. Okay. Now, brachialis, if you don't know, that's just a fancy term for upper arm. So wherever you see that, they're talking about your humerus. Okay. So we know then that the insertion point is going to be on the humerus. And the origin with this is that coracoid process on the scapula. Okay. So coracoid process, brachialis, right? And imagine contraction of this orientation here. It's just going to pull that arm in this direction. So it's not going to lift it up and away. It's going to adduct. And in fact, it's going to pull shoulders down a bit. So in fact, you adduct and hunch. Give us a shoulder hunch. Let's see. Last, probably my favorite muscles within the human body, the serratus anterior. Okay. So these wrap around here. And you can see them, they're well defined on certain individuals. You can kind of rub your fingers along them. Mine used to be better. Serratus. So that sounds like serration, right? And that's what we get. We get this serrated like pattern with these serratus anterior muscles. The origin for these, you can see, is on these ribs. And the insertion we can't quite see, but it wraps around and it's on the scapula. So imagine contraction then of this. What is that going to give us? It's going back to the scapula now. Well, it's going to give us protraction of the shoulder. Okay. And you can feel that. If you protract your shoulders and you hold on here to your serratus anterior, you'll feel those muscles tense up. And I encourage you to kind of feel what's going on when you're studying these muscles. It'll help you learn them a little better on your own body. So, okay, so protraction of the shoulder, serratus anterior contraction. Okay, onto the rotator cuffs. Probably all heard of the rotator cuff, but what is it? It's a specific group of muscles that surrounds the shoulder joint, and it's highly prone to injury. This is actually a kind of a confusing image. I've tried to work through it for the past couple of years. I just can't wrap my head around it. They're trying to say that you can work through these different rotator cuff muscles going through the action of a pitch, and no doubt you can, but I think their actions and images here are confusing for what they're trying to display. So I think when you're studying this, it's going to be easier to ignore this image and think about each of these muscles individually. It's going to give us a truer idea of the action rather than trying to wrap your mind around this. And I'll give you an example. So let's start with the subscapularis here. Okay. So here we have the anterior view, right? So this guy's pectoral muscle will be right here. Okay. And then we have the subscapularis on the scapula. Kind of confusing because it's called subscapula, which means below, but it's on the anterior portion of the scapula. So picture it like you're looking from the back, I guess. But anyway, this is anterior view. It's on the front part of that scapula. So the origin is obviously on the scapula, we can see that. And then the insertion is up on the humerus, okay? You can see the upper part of the humerus here. So we have this type of orientation here. So with contraction, that's gonna cause, and we can look, we're more medial here with this insertion point on the arm. So you can picture then, it's gonna pull that humerus medially, right? It's gonna rotate it inward. So that's going to give us a medial rotation of the shoulder. Okay. It's going to pull that shoulder medial toward the midline. And these other muscles here, we actually just worked through already. The supraspinatus, that works to abduct the infraspinatus and teres minor, those lead to a lateral rotation. But you can see why this is kind of confusing. So we get this medial rotation here with a contraction of the subscapularis, and this is their example action within a pitch. I don't know. All right, moving on to muscles that move the forearm. Okay, so this is everything below the humerus here. Most of these muscles, they tend to originate in the upper arm, the humerus, we call brachialis, and then insert upon the forearm. Okay, and that makes sense. So we have forearm flexors, many of which, when we're talking about flexing our arm, you're familiar with, like the biceps. And then we have forearm extensors, just to extend the arm, right? And you can feel those contract on the backside because they have to extend. And again, most of these originate upper arm, insert on the lower part, the forearm. So let's start with forearm flexors here. These tend to be located on the anterior side of the arm. So you got to picture then anteriorly, we got to go back and think about anatomical position, right? So that's standing up, palms forward, wearing pajama pants. And so it's everything here, okay? So they include our biceps, which you're familiar with. And then remember biceps, that's, I think that's cephalai would be Greek for head. So we have 2 heads, and then triceps, then 3 heads. Okay, so we have the biceps brachii, the brachialis, and the brachioradialis. So the big one that you know is the biceps brachii. And this is one exception to this highlighted info above, this origination on the humerus and inserting on the forearm. The biceps is actually going to originate on the scapula, okay? So the scapula, and then it's going to insert on the radius. So again, that's in the forearm, so that part holds true, but we're not originating in the humerus here, originating on the scapula. What else is going to tell you about that one? Yeah, so that's going to lead to contractions, going to be flexion at the elbow. And oh, here's something kind of cool. Contraction of the biceps is also needed for supination of the forearms. Remember, that's palms out instead of backs of palms. And try this with me here. 1 second. Go ahead and try to point your pinky up, straight up into the air without flexing your biceps, okay? So start with your palm flat and try to point your pinky up all the way up without flexing your biceps, okay? It can't be done. And that's because the biceps, in addition to flexion, is associated with supination of the forearm. So you can feel that contraction there. All right, what else do I want to move through with this one? That's an example of a forearm flexor. Then we have the forearm extensors. The only one I think you need to know is the triceps brachii. So these, while these were located anteriorly, these are located posteriorly when in anatomical position. So again, that just means back of your arm here. You can feel your triceps, big muscle. Okay, that's good for that slide. We'll move in and actually start looking at some of these muscles then. So we'll start with the anterior muscles of the arm, the front side. Probably one that's easiest to start with is the brachioradialis. And this is easy because when you're in anatomical position here, you can feel this one, right? It's the lateral most forearm muscle here, this big one. So you wiggle your thumb and you can kind of feel it. Okay. So it's on that lateral edge. And we can break down that word, right? To figure out what's going on, the origin insertion. We have the brachio, which we said means upper arm. and then the radialis. So we know the insertion is on the radius. Okay. And a little trick here with bones and the muscles, I guess it would be a bone trick. The radius goes to your thumb, while the ulna goes to your pinky. Okay. So that brachioradialis is going to run from the humerus and then down to your thumb side. Okay. And that contraction then of that muscle or the action, again with the brachioradialis, if we got an insertion point on the humerus and an origin on the humerus and insertion on the lower arm, that's going to give us flexion once more. It's an anterior located muscle, and those lead to flexion. Next up, let's look at the coracobrachialis. A little bit, I'd say a little bit, very difficult to see here. It's deep to these biceps brachii. Here you can see those two heads now of the biceps, right? The two heads, bicep. And then deep to that, we have the coracobrachialis. Break down that name, we have coraco, we have the coracoid process, and then we have the brachialis, which we've said now multiple times means upper arm. Okay, so the action that we see there, again, this is an anterior forearm or arm muscle, so that's going to lead to flexion. Okay, those ones are pretty simple. Move on to the backside here. This is going to involve our triceps, that three-headed muscle. Okay. You got to know the, not on my list here, triceps. You need to know the lateral head and the long head. So here's your long head, lateral head. So you can see that there are two different origins for this muscle. Okay. For the long head, we see the origin is on the scapula, and the lateral, the origin is on the humerus. Okay. The insertion for both these is the ulna. Okay. So remember, that's going to be above the pinky then. Okay. And remember, when we're talking about the backside of the arm here, that muscle has to do with extension. The triceps has to do with extending the arm. Anterior side is flexion. All right, muscles of the forearm then. These get a little tougher, but thankfully they're named for the action that they accomplish. Let's start with one of those. Here we have the supinator. It's the worst superhero name ever. So the supinator, you can probably guess, if you can picture your hand now, not in an anatomical position, but in a prone position, and you can picture then contraction of this supinator muscle. Guess you can't really see it well right there, but you can picture it right here. Picture a contraction this way if your hand is in this prone position. Okay? It's going to flip your arm into the supine position. It's going to supinate that forearm, hence supinator. Yes, opposite of that then, we have the pronator teres. Okay? So if we're in a supine position, palm out, you can picture contraction of this pronator teres. Look at the origin and the insertion. This probably is an easier image over on this side. The supine view. Contraction is going to pronate that forearm and hand. It's going to be the same thing with this pronator quadratus, right? Contraction, radius connected to ulna here, and it's going to flip and pronate that hand. Get a little more tricky as we go here. So here we have muscles that move the hand. Now, muscles that move the wrist, okay, these are going to be found more superficially. superficiously. Okay. And they're going to insert within the hand typically. We can compare that then to muscles that move the fingers. These are going to be found deeper, deep to those muscles that move the wrist. And they're going to insert within the fingers then. Okay. So muscles that move the wrist found more superficially and insert within the hand. Muscles that move fingers found deeper to those and insert within the fingers. Okay. So we can also see here with these wrist muscles, they're named for the action that they complete for the most part. Okay, this is a big tendon here. The flexor, flexor, extensor, extensor, extensor. And the same trend actually is going to continue when we move to the muscles that move the fingers. Okay. Flexor, flexor, extensor, extensor. Again, these are easier to look at than they are to talk about like this. So let's move on. This is where I said it gets a little tricky because we have lots of muscles here and they tend to look very similar. So you need some type of landmark to orient yourself to start off. So you're going to want to start with this anatomical position, palms out. And then the landmark that I like to use, just because it's the most obvious, is this brachioradialis. Remember, that's that lateral muscle you can feel here on your forearm, the most lateral. Okay, so that's a good landmark. And then you can just move lateral to medial when naming these muscles. I think that's a good trick. Another way to orient yourself here, I don't know if we have a good image right here, is this palmaris longus. Okay, so we have this muscle here with this giant tendon, okay, the longest tendon that goes throughout the palm. So you can see here, this goes all the way down here to your wrist. Okay, so you can start there, and then that runs deep underneath some other muscles. But what I wanted to show you about why this palmaris longus is cool is because you either have one or two of these tendons here within your wrist associated with this palmaris longus. So what you can do to check this out is you can put your hand under the table. It helps if you stand up and kind of pull or push up, and you can feel along your wrist whether you have one ridge or two. So I have one. I have one tendon here for that palmaris longus, but some people have two, and it's just one of those weird, goofy evolution things that isn't selected for anymore. So you can have one or two tendons there. And really with these, they all look the same. You got to orient yourself. So start with that brachioradialis. And then what I think is going to be good for you is, so find that landmark, and then you got to come up with some type of mnemonic device as you move left, right, or right to left that you can remember. Just something stupid, right? We had that, I don't even remember what they were, the facial nerves. We came up with a few. I don't know. I'll go over one with the legs shortly, but I think that's the best way to learn these muscles. Just takes some memorization in this part. So if we move on to the pelvic girdle, these muscles here that move the thigh, these are what I mentioned are just bigger, and there are fewer. So if you can apply the same tricks that we've just done with the, upper appendicular musculature, you'll be in good shape. I'll go through a couple. So, I just said so. This is one of my favorites too, the psoas minor and the psoa major. Okay. So I don't know if anyone follows the bio Instagram page, but we had a cartoon up there the other day. So as I was saying, that's the muscle we were referring to here. This flexes and raises the leg then, contraction of this muscle, right? You can picture abduction of the leg with a contraction pulling up. And then, and as an example, I said to come up with some type of mnemonic device to learn those forearm muscles. Here's one that I did for the upper leg here. We have the pectineus, the adductor brevis, the adductor longus, and the gracilis. Okay. Yeah, did I skip one? Yeah, I did. I skipped the magnus. That's in between. So if we do, let's see, I'll label these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that way we're moving laterally to medially. Okay. And the mnemonic device that I came up with, really dumb, but people liked it last year, was pretty boys like more gel. Okay. I use tons of hair gel, so no offense to anybody. I'm a pretty boy, I guess. But pectineus, brevis, longus, magnus, and gracilis. Yeah, so do something like that, goofy with your forearm muscles. I didn't come up with one, but. And that's all I got for today. All right. Any questions? How are we doing with taking complete anatomy practicals? Are we chugging along?
Is there a day that we'll need to complete the third practical by? Do you know?
Is there a day you'll have to complete it by?
Yeah, for like just like.
Okay. Oh, you mean for the end of the? I imagine to be by the last finals day of that block.
Okay. Yeah,
that's what I
would think. Before that. Okay. Also, one other quick thing. I was scrolling through my For You page on TikTok the other day, and I saw a video from Millennial Doc. I was wondering if you knew who that was.
Hey, keep that to yourself. Yeah, that's me. I try to keep it PC, I guess. I was afraid of students finding me on there, so I'll try to put up more educational content, I guess, rather than just my snowmen doing terrible things. Yeah, that's really funny. There are some really good, as much as I make fun of TikTok, there are some awesome anatomical pages out there and some like medical staff that have just awesome pages. Institute of Complete Anatomy is one.
I've enjoyed that on the Instagram stories.
Yep. And then there's an eye doctor that I follow who's just hilarious. But there's some good stuff mixed in with all the craziness. Any other questions, concerns? I think what I'm going to go in and do next is look at where people are, make sure people have even logged into Complete Anatomy at this point. Might send some friendly emails to people. If that's it, then I'll post this shortly. Remember, I'll email a link to everyone and then also post on the lab page under the discussion tab. So as always, email me with any questions and we'll hear from you guys soon, okay? All right, take care. Later.
See you.
See ya.